The war ended on paper, the guns went quiet, the units went home, but some names stayed behind. Years later, a small team moves through jungle that has already swallowed the war. There are no front lines now, no orders shouted over gunfire, just heat, rot, insects, and the slow work of digging where someone never came back. This is not combat, it is recovery. For the United States military, this has become one of the longest missions. Some cases are older than the people sent to find them. Aircraft vanished without witnesses, patrols never checked in, graves were rushed, moved, or never marked at all. The fighting stopped. Time moved on. The missing did not. This is the story of the people who refused to stop looking. When a service member goes missing in war, the word used to describe them matters. Missing in action, or MIA, is not the same as killed in action. It is not the same as prisoner of war. It is something in between, and that uncertainty changes everything. An MIA is someone who did not return and whose fate could not be confirmed. There was no body recovered, no grave that could be verified. Sometimes there were no witnesses at all. An aircraft went down and disappeared. A patrol never checked back in. A battlefield moved before the dead could be counted. In earlier wars, this happened often. Records were handwritten, radios failed, units were destroyed or scattered. In the confusion of combat, especially in remote areas, it was easy for a person to vanish without clear answers. For families, MIA status was different from death. There was no certainty, no funeral, no place to visit. Some were told their loved ones might still be alive. Others were told nothing at all. That limbo could last for years or decades. The military eventually created other categories to deal with this. One of them was presumptive finding of death. This meant that enough time had passed and enough evidence had been reviewed to officially declare the person dead, even without recovered remains. On paper, the case could be closed. For families, it often was not. During World War II, tens of thousands of Americans were listed as missing. Many were later recovered. Others were never found. The Korean War added more. But it was Vietnam that turned the word MIA into something political, emotional, and permanent in the public mind. Vietnam had everything that made recoveries hard: thick jungle, mountain terrain, aircraft losses over remote areas, ground units operating far from support. Many service members disappeared in places that were difficult or impossible to search during the war itself. As years passed, MIA cases began to stack up. Some were real, others were misunderstandings. In some cases, remains had already been recovered, but not correctly identified. In others, records were wrong or incomplete. Still, the question remained: who was missing, and what had happened to them? This uncertainty created pressure. Families wanted answers. The public demanded action. The government had to decide whether searching for the missing was a wartime task or a permanent responsibility. Over time, the answer became clear. An MIA case was not just an unresolved report, it was a promise left unfinished. And once that promise existed, walking away from it became impossible. That decision, to keep looking long after the fighting stopped, would shape one of the longest-running missions in American military history. During World War II, the scale of death made precision impossible. Battles moved fast, front lines shifted overnight, aircraft were lost over oceans, jungles, and mountains with no witnesses. When the fighting moved on, the dead were often left behind. At first, recovery was simple and immediate. Units buried their own. Graves were marked if time allowed. Sometimes they were not. In the chaos of combat, the priority was survival, not record keeping. As the war expanded, the U.S. military realized this approach was not enough. Millions of soldiers were spread across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. Deaths were mounting. Families back home wanted answers. This led to the creation of a dedicated system for the dead, the Graves Registration Service. Their job was blunt and difficult: locate remains, identify them if possible, record burial locations, move graves when needed. In theory, this created order. In practice, it often fell apart. In Europe, recoveries were sometimes straightforward. Towns were mapped, locals could point to burial sites, records survived more often. Even so, many graves were temporary. Some were moved more than once. Errors happened, names were spelled wrong, markers were misplaced. The Pacific was worse. Aircraft went down in open water and were never seen again. Ground fighting took place on remote islands that were later abandoned. Jungle growth erased crash sites within months. In some cases, the only record of a loss was a last radio transmission, or nothing at all. After the war ended, the recovery mission did not. Teams returned to former battlefields to locate missing remains. Thousands were found, thousands were not. Some were declared lost at sea. Others were listed as missing with no clear path forward. Then came Korea. The Korean War created a new set of problems. The front line shifted constantly. Units advanced, retreated, and advanced again. Bodies were buried quickly, sometimes under fire. Graves were lost when terrain changed hands. In the winter, frozen ground made recovery impossible. When Chinese forces entered the war, chaos followed. Retreats were sudden, equipment was abandoned, records were destroyed. Entire units were overrun or scattered. Many service members disappeared in these moments, leaving no clear trace of what happened next. After the armistice, limited exchanges of remains took place. Some MIAs were resolved, many were not. Political tensions froze cooperation. Large areas were no longer accessible. Time began to work against recovery. By the early 1950s, a pattern had formed. Recoveries during war were rushed and imperfect. Post-war recoveries depended on access, cooperation, and records that were often incomplete or wrong. The longer a case stayed open, the harder it became to close. Still, the military kept the files. Not because success was guaranteed, but because abandoning them meant accepting that some losses simply did not matter enough to pursue. That line, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. World War II and Korea taught the same lesson. If the missing were ever going to be found, it would not be quick. It would be slow, methodical, and often carried out decades after the last shot was fired. That lesson would collide head-on with the next war, one that turned missing service members into a national obsession. Vietnam changed what missing meant. In earlier wars, MIAs were tragic but distant. Vietnam brought the issue into living rooms. It put faces on it, names, photographs, and a question that refused to go away. What if they were still alive? The war created the perfect conditions for uncertainty. Aircraft were lost over jungle and mountains. Helicopters went down in places that could not be reached. Ground units operated in small numbers, far from support. Firefights happened fast, then vanished into thick terrain that erased evidence almost immediately. Many losses had no witnesses. A plane disappeared from radar. A patrol failed to return. A last radio call cut off mid-sentence. After that, nothing. Unlike World War II or Korea, Vietnam did not end cleanly. There was no clear victory, no final accounting. When U.S. forces withdrew, thousands of Americans were still listed as missing. Some cases were real mysteries. Others were the result of poor records, duplicate reports, or remains that had already been recovered but never matched to a name. To families, those distinctions did not matter. At home, the MIA issue grew into something larger than the war itself. Families organized, advocacy groups formed. The black and white POW MIA flag became a symbol of unfinished business. The idea took hold that Americans were being left behind. The government faced pressure from every direction. Families demanded answers. The public demanded action. Politicians demanded results. But Vietnam presented a hard truth. Many answers no longer existed. Some aircraft had exploded on impact. Some losses occurred in areas that were bombed repeatedly after the crash. Some remains were buried hastily by local villagers, then moved, forgotten, or destroyed by time and weather. In other cases, information existed, but it was buried in enemy archives or locked behind political barriers. Negotiations made the problem worse before they made it better. As relations with North Vietnam slowly reopened, the U.S. pushed for information and access. Some cooperation followed. Remains were returned. Crash sites were identified, but progress was slow, uneven, and often frustrating. Each recovery raised hopes and reminded families how many cases were still unresolved. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the MIA issue had become deeply emotional and deeply political. Rumors spread that Americans were still being held. Some claims were sincere, others were false, exaggerated, or deliberately misleading. Every unconfirmed report reignited old wounds. Inside the military and intelligence community, the picture was colder and more complicated. Analysts reviewed loss records. They compared reports. They determined that many MIAs were almost certainly killed at the time of loss. But certainty without remains did not feel like certainty at all to the people waiting at home. This gap between emotional truth and physical evidence defined the Vietnam MIA crisis. The result was a shift in policy. The U.S. government committed to continued recovery efforts, even decades after the war ended. Not because every case could be solved, but because stopping would mean admitting that time alone could erase responsibility. Vietnam forced a decision that could not be undone. Recovering the missing was no longer just a wartime task. It became a permanent mission, one that would continue long after the politics faded, long after the headlines stopped, and long after most of the people who fought the war were gone. That decision would change how future recoveries were handled. It would also lead to something new, a dedicated system built not to fight wars, but to go back and finish them. By the late 1970s, it was clear that MIA recovery could no longer be handled as a side task. Too many cases were still open. Too many records were scattered across different branches, agencies, and archives. Each war had been handled differently. Each left behind its own mess. There was no single system, no single group of truly responsible for finishing the job. Vietnam forced that issue. Public pressure made ignoring MIAs impossible. Political pressure made inconsistency unacceptable. The government needed a permanent answer, not temporary fixes. That meant turning recovery into a standing mission, even in peacetime. The first step was organization. Separate offices were created to track cases, review records, and coordinate with foreign governments. Analysts were assigned full-time to missing personnel files. Historians began re-examining old loss reports, sometimes written decades earlier under fire. What had once been treated as closed history was reopened piece by piece. But paperwork alone did not recover anyone. Actual recovery required boots on the ground, often in places the U.S. military had not set foot in since the war ended. That meant negotiations, permissions, and cooperation with former enemies. It also meant accepting limits. Some areas were inaccessible. Some governments refused access. Some sites no longer existed in any usable form. Despite that, recovery teams were sent. By the 1980s and 1990s, these efforts were consolidated into a single operational organization, the Joint POW-MIA Accounting Command. Its mission was narrow and unforgiving. Find missing service members, recover remains, identify them if possible, return them home. This was not a symbolic effort. Teams deployed into jungles, mountains, deserts, and underwater crash sites. They worked in extreme heat, poor weather, and areas still littered with unexploded ordnance. They excavated old graves, they sifted soil by hand, they documented everything, knowing that one mistake could contaminate evidence beyond recovery. Time was the enemy in every case. Witnesses aged or died, memories faded, landscapes changed, jungles reclaimed crash sites, rivers shifted, villages were relocated. In some cases, teams arrived at a location only to find that the site described in records no longer existed in any recognizable form. Still, the mission continued. Recovery operations became slow by necessity. Each case could take years. Some took decades. A single positive identification might require dozens of field missions, thousands of pages of records, and cooperation across multiple countries. And many cases ended without answers. That reality forced another shift in thinking. Success could no longer be measured only by recoveries. It had to include effort, documentation, exhaustion of evidence, the ability to say honestly that everything possible had been done. This was not satisfying, it was not clean, but it was the only standard that could survive contact with reality. By committing to a permanent recovery mission, the U.S. accepted something uncomfortable. Some wars would never fully end, not for the families, not for the records, and not for the people sent back to places everyone else had already moved on from. The creation of a dedicated recovery system did not solve the MIA problem. It simply ensured that forgetting was no longer an option. From that point on, missing service members were no longer lost to history by default. They were assigned a place in an active process, one that moved slowly, often painfully, but refused to stop. The mission had changed. Now it was no longer about closing files. It was about accounting for people. And that meant the work ahead would be measured not in years, but in generations. Most recoveries do not start in the field. They start at a desk. Before anyone digs, dives, or hikes into remote terrain, a case has to be rebuilt from whatever still exists. That usually means old records, mission reports, aircraft logs, radio transcripts, handwritten notes made by people who never expected them to be read again. Many of these records are incomplete. Some contradict each other, some are wrong. Analysts compare dates, locations, unit movements, and weather reports. They look for patterns. They try to narrow a loss down from somewhere in the jungle to a specific valley, ridge, or stretch of river. Witnesses matter, but they are rare. In some cases, local villagers remember an aircraft crash or a hurried burial. In others, former enemy soldiers provide information decades later. These accounts are valuable, but they are also fragile. Memories fade, locations are described using landmarks that no longer exist. A big tree or old trail may have disappeared years ago. Once enough information is gathered, a field mission is planned. These missions are not quick. Teams travel with historians, scientists, medics, security personnel, and local support. They bring tools for excavation, mapping equipment, and documentation. In many areas, unexploded bombs and shells are still present, turning a recovery site into a minefield. When a team reaches the site, the work slows down even more. Excavation is careful and deliberate. Soil is removed in thin layers. Everything is screened. Bone fragments, aircraft debris, uniform pieces, and personal items are all treated as evidence. Even small finds matter. A single fragment can confirm a location or support an identification later. Nothing is assumed. A crash site does not always mean remains are present. An aircraft may have exploded, burned, or scattered debris across a wide area. In some cases, remains were recovered long ago by locals or buried elsewhere. Teams document what they find and what they do not. Underwater recoveries are even harder. Aircraft lost at sea may rest hundreds or thousands of feet below the surface. Saltwater corrodes metal, currents scatter debris, visibility is limited. Some sites are simply beyond reach. Others require remotely operated vehicles and years of planning. Even when a wreck is located, recovery may not be possible. Each mission ends the same way: documentation. Everything found is logged, photographed, labeled, and transported. Soil samples are taken, coordinates are recorded. Nothing leaves the site without a clear chain of custody. Mistakes here can ruin years of work later. After the field mission ends, the case is far from over. Recovered material is sent to laboratories for analysis. Bone fragments are examined, personal effects are studied, aircraft parts are compared to known losses. Sometimes what comes back is enough to move forward. Often it is not. Some cases require multiple field missions. New information may surface years later. A site once inaccessible may finally open. A witness may come forward. Each update sends the case back through the system again. This slow pace frustrates families and sometimes the teams themselves. From the outside, it can look like nothing is happening. In reality, most of the work is invisible. It happens in files, databases, and quiet rooms where evidence is reviewed again and again. The hardest part is knowing that effort does not guarantee results. Some cases end without recovery. Others end with remains that cannot be identified. Time, environment, and chance work against certainty. There are limits to what science and persistence can overcome. Still, teams go back. They return to sites that failed before. They recheck locations others gave up on, not because success is likely, but because the mission demands that every reasonable effort be made. That standard is unforgiving. It does not allow shortcuts. It does not allow assumptions. And it does not allow the comfort of closure unless it can be earned. Recovery work is slow because it has to be. Speed creates errors. Errors erase answers. And once a site is disturbed incorrectly, it may never speak again. So the teams move carefully. They document everything, and they accept a hard truth. Finding the missing is not about guarantees. It's about proving that forgetting was never an option. Recovery does not end when the remains are found. In many ways, that's where the hardest part begins. What comes back from the field is rarely complete. Often it is fragmented. Sometimes it's only a few small pieces of bone mixed with soil, metal, or fabric. Time, weather, fire, and animals all leave their mark. After decades, the body itself may no longer exist in any recognizable form. This is where science takes over. Forensic anthropologists begin by determining whether remains are human. If they are, they assess age, sex, stature, and signs of trauma. Even this step can be difficult. Bones may be broken, burned, or worn down until key features are gone. Personal effects help, but they are not proof on their own. Dog tags can be lost or swapped. Uniform pieces can belong to anyone in the unit. Aircraft parts can confirm a crash, but not the identity of who was inside. Every clue has to be supported by something else. Dental records were once the strongest tool available. If a jaw or teeth survived, they could sometimes be matched to military dental files. But many cases lack usable dental remains. Others involve records that were lost, damaged, or never created in the first place. DNA changed the process, but it did not solve everything. When possible, scientists extract DNA from bone or teeth. This DNA is compared to reference samples provided by family members. A match can provide certainty that no other method can. But DNA does not always survive. Heat, moisture, and time break it down. Some samples are too degraded to test. Others produce results that are incomplete or inconclusive. Even when DNA is available, it is not instant. Testing takes time. Matches must meet strict statistical standards. Partial matches are not enough. The goal is certainty, not probability. That standard protects families, but it also means some cases remain unresolved. There's another problem that complicates everything: commingling. In mass loss events, remains may be mixed together. Aircraft crashes, hurried burials, and battlefield recoveries can combine fragments from multiple individuals. Separating them later can take years. Sometimes it cannot be done at all. When identification is not possible, a case may remain open indefinitely. This is one of the hardest truths of the recovery mission. Effort does not guarantee answers. Science has limits. Some losses happen in ways that erase evidence completely. No amount of digging or testing can bring back what no longer exists. For families, this reality is devastating. They are often told that everything possible has been done, and that it still was not enough. There is no ceremony for uncertainty, no marker that fully satisfies, only the knowledge that the search was real, even if the result was not. When identification is possible, the moment carries weight. Families are notified, the process is careful and deliberate, nothing is rushed. Military honors follow. A name that existed only on a list for decades is finally tied to remains that can be buried, visited, and remembered properly. But even success carries complexity. Some families have waited so long that the people who first asked the questions are no longer alive to hear the answers. Children become grandparents, spouses pass away, closure arrives, but late. The science does its job without emotion. It measures, compares, and confirms. It does not promise miracles. It only offers truth when truth can be proven. And when it cannot, the system does something unusual. It keeps the file open. No expiration date, no automatic closure, no assumption that time alone means the case no longer matters. This is the quiet contract behind the recovery mission. If certainty can be reached, it will be. If it cannot, the search remains part of the record, waiting for better science, new information, or a chance that has not yet arrived. Science can answer many questions, but it cannot erase loss, and it cannot guarantee resolution. What it can do is ensure that when a name is finally removed from the missing list, it is done with honesty and with proof. Today, the search for missing service members is still active. It is no longer tied to one war or one generation. Cases from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam remain open. New ones are added for more recent conflicts. Time has changed the tools, but not the responsibility. Modern recovery operations are handled by the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. Its job is simple to state and hard to execute: locate, recover, identify, and return missing U.S. service members from past wars. The work is global. Teams deploy to Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, Europe, and remote mountain regions. Some missions take place in jungles that have reclaimed old battlefields. Others happen underwater, where aircraft had rested undisturbed for decades. Each site brings its own risks and limits. Unlike earlier decades, cooperation is now common. Former enemy nations often assist with access, records, and local support. Archives once closed are slowly opened. Old crash reports are re-examined. Information that did not exist or could not be shared during the war becomes usable years later. Technology has changed the pace, but not the difficulty. Satellite imagery helps narrow search areas. Digital mapping reconstructs old flight paths. DNA science has improved identification, but none of this replaces the need for field work. Someone still has to walk the ground, someone still has to dig, and someone still has to accept that many sites will produce nothing at all. The number of unresolved cases remains high. Some losses occurred in places that no longer exist. Others were destroyed by later combat or development. In some cases, the environment erased all physical evidence long before the recovery teams arrived. These cases stay open, not because answers are expected, but because closing them without proof would be dishonest. Recovery work today is quieter than in the past. There are no protests, no headlines, no daily updates. The public attention that once surrounded MIAs has faded, but the mission continues anyway, largely out of view. This matters. A mission that depends on attention is fragile. A mission that continues without it is something else entirely. It becomes a matter of policy, culture, and commitment rather than pressure. Each year, names come off the missing list. Not many, not fast, but steadily. Every identification represents years of work that most people will never see, and many names remain. The mission today is not driven by the belief that every case will be solved. It is driven by the refusal to decide that some losses no longer deserve effort. As long as records exist, as long as science improves, and as long as access is possible, the search continues. Not because it is easy, not because it is visible, but because it was promised. For families, the recovery mission is not abstract. It is measured in empty chairs, unanswered questions, and years spent waiting for news that may never come. While wars end for nations, they do not end for the people who never learned what happened to someone they loved. MIA status creates a unique kind of loss. There is no grave, no confirmed date of death, no clear moment to begin grieving. Some families are told to hope, others are told to prepare for the worst. Many are told nothing at all. Over time, that uncertainty becomes a burden of its own. Spouses grow old waiting for answers. Children grow up knowing a parent only through photographs and stories. In some cases, the people who filed the original missing person report do not live long enough to see it resolved. When identification finally happens, the moment is complicated. There is relief, there is grief, there is sometimes anger that it took so long. There is also a strange sense of time collapsing, decades of waiting compressed into a single phone call or letter. Military burial honors matter because they replace absence with something tangible. A name finally has a place. A story has an ending that can be marked and remembered. But even then, the years of uncertainty do not disappear. For families whose cases remain unresolved, the promise still matters. Knowing that a case is active, that it has not been dismissed or forgotten, provides a form of recognition. It says that the loss counts, even if the outcome is uncertain. That recognition is often the only thing that keeps the waiting bearable. The recovery mission also sends a message beyond individual families. It tells current service members that their fate will not be ignored if the worst happens. It reinforces the idea that military service carries a responsibility that does not expire when the war does. That belief shapes trust between those who serve and the institution that sends them. This promise is not written into any treaty. It is not enforced by law. It exists because breaking it would mean accepting that some people could be erased by time and distance. The recovery mission refuses that idea. It accepts that answers may never come, but it does not accept indifference. As long as there is a name on the missing list, there is an obligation attached to it. That obligation has outlived wars, governments, and generations. And for the families still waiting, that may be the only thing standing between loss and being forgotten. In the end, MIA recovery is not about numbers. It is not about how many cases are solved or how fast names come off a list. It is about whether time is allowed to erase responsibility. Wars end, records fade, witnesses disappear, landscapes change. None of that changes the fact that someone was lost and that the loss was noticed. The recovery mission exists in the space between what can be proven and what cannot. Some cases will be solved, others will not. That outcome does not measure the value of the effort. What matters is that the search continues. Each recovery says that service does not end with disappearance. Each open file says that uncertainty is not the same as abandonment. Even when science reaches its limits, the obligation remains. There is no final victory here, no moment when every case is closed, only a standard that has been set and upheld. As long as names remain on the missing list, the mission is not finished. And as long as the mission continues, those names are not lost to history. They are recorded, they are remembered, and they are still being looked for. This is what accounted for means. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
He's a Dave, dude. Dave's got to stick together, you know what I mean?